that lovely introduction. So I live in Cook County in the Chicago, Illinois region, but I grew up in Southern Illinois, and I'm a lifelong member of the Illinois Native Plant Society. So I'm really excited to talk to all of you, and I'm jealous because I love doing botanizing down in Southern Illinois. So you'll have to see some sites for me since I can't get down there as much as I would like. So anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about ecological restoration, what that means, and some of the data that we've collected to share with you, and in hopes that it might be helpful for you in thinking about managing land down in Southern Illinois or anywhere else in Illinois for that matter. Okay, so just in case, just a quick review, what do I mean by ecological restoration? Well, basically, it's the process of repairing sites in nature whose biological communities and ecosystems have degraded with modern settlement. So, places where we might have dirty water entering a system from a roadway, or we have soil disturbance for various factors. Could have been grazing in the past. It could be trails now. So any of these factors that are really altering the landscape. And when it does enough damage, what do you do to restore it or try to bring back the biodiversity that is at that site? We're never trying to return it to some mythical time in the past. One, we don't even know exactly what it would have looked like 200, 300 years ago. But what we are trying to do is maintain the biodiversity that we already have, because we think that's a really, really important thing. So I always like to joke that I wish I actually had this book, The Cliff Notes to Illinois Ecology and Natural History, but unfortunately no such thing exists. So a lot of times when you're trying to figure out what's best to do on the land, you're pulling together a lot of different resources. And the Forest Preserve, we've spent a lot of time trying to do this. We've evaluated all of our land. We've looked at some of the histories, as well as the 1939 aerials of what the Forest Preserve looked like at that time. And we've looked at the pioneer settlement history notes when they plotted out all the land to figure out how to sell it to farmers and other folks. So whenever we're trying to restore, we're basically trying to understand past human landscape practices and the ecological history of that site. We try to understand what we are seeing on the landscape right now, because it can give us hints to the condition. And then we're trying to know what to restore, enhance, or protect to, again, maintain that biodiversity. So this kind of gives you an idea. These are the public land surveys. This was a study done by the Morton Arboretum, and they've graciously allowed us to share this map. But a couple hundred years ago, or actually around 1839, when the surveys were done, this is what Cook County, Illinois looked like. And the green represents prairie, wet marshes, and treeless areas. And the brown was what was forest, woodland, or savanna. And then obviously the blue would be river systems and marshes and deeper water. This is an example of something that can be extremely helpful when trying to understand the landscape. So this is a picture of Rgensen Woods Nature Preserve. This is one of our highest quality complexes located in the south side of Cook County. I want you to pay close attention to what this looks like from 1939. I mean, obviously you can see that this is somewhat of a remnant community. It doesn't look like it's been plowed by a farmer. Maybe it would have been grazed, but you definitely see that the vegetation is largely intact. Over here, you can see this is clearly a farm field where definitely the soil was greatly disturbed. But look at this picture, and then I'm going to show you what this site looks like today. So, clearly there's been a huge impact over time and what has happened to this landscape. So why did it suddenly become so dense with forest? And is that a good thing or not? So that's some of the things that we try to figure out. And I'm going to explain more about this in just a second. So we know that in Cook County and much of Illinois, the land was managed by Native peoples to increase and reduce woody vegetation in much of the landscape. This was done for various reasons, but one of the most important was that they wanted to reduce the amount of woody species because it provided more grasses and flowers, which were important for the larger animals that they were surviving on, such as the American bison. And also probably because of the medicinal uses and other uses of having a very biodiverse and complex system. So, we know that these were regularly started. We know in Illinois that with natural water levels, the amount of rainfall we get, that we could be, just as we are now, called the forest preserves of Cook County. But, again, from these land surveys and other things, we know that it was mostly more open and more prairie systems where we were at. So, Native Americans were definitely the piece that was maintaining more of that open habitat. There simply wasn't enough lightning fires to maintain the more open habitat that was present. The issue that I think sometimes people get confused about is that you can take the fire out of the system, but that doesn't mean the plants are going to adapt to that. So what we have found in the forest preserves of Cook County is that our entire system that grows on the ground layer, not the trees, but the grasses, the forbs, the sedges, any of the graminoids, they really depend on high light levels. And so if we suppress fire, the woody species are set to come back with a vengeance. And when they do that, they create such a dense shade that the bottom of the ground layer in our oak savannas and woodlands and other areas become depauperate of vegetation very quickly. And only a couple select species can survive in that amount of dense shade. And if we allow this to happen, then we are losing the vast, vast majority of the biodiversity that is found in Illinois. And we've got so many different habitats and different natural communities, and almost all of them are virtually fire dependent. So one of the things that the Forest Preserves has started to do is to manage the land with fire. It's an integral part of how we manage it. And we know that we're trying, not that we're trying to angle for an exact number, but we are trying to manage for light levels. So if it's a prairie, we want to make sure that the structure is that most of the ground is not going to be covered by trees that are going to shade out the prairie plants. Savanna, obviously a little bit more shade. And as we go, on the gradient to woodland, we can allow more trees to grow. So, that's kind of what we're trying to do, is we're trying to restore that structure, because if we don't, then we see the entire, again, ground level vegetation snuff out. Obviously, another thing that we're really struggling with, and I know this is a struggle in Southern Illinois, is where you've plowed the land for agriculture. That is really, really synonymous with where we find the predominance of invasive species, such as common buckthorn. Common buckthorn, I know, isn't as bad of a problem in Southern Illinois. I know you have more challenges with things like Japanese honeysuckle and now burning bush, which I know is becoming a bigger problem, but the sentiments are the same. So one way that we can really tell this is a 1938 aerial of a site in Cook County, and then here's the same landscape in 2017. And you can kind of see from the 1938 aerial that this area was an open farm field where the previous landowner before it was acquired was ag land, okay? And you can kind of see that clearly. Now I want you to watch this, because this is what this area is today, and you can kind of see it's a darker color of woodland. And when we do our vegetation surveys, what we find is where the farmed area where we can exactly see dense stands of this invasive species called common buckthorn, and it's basically dominating the entire system. So eventually, if you don't maintain the light levels that are needed and you don't control those invasive species, you start to see bare ground conditions. So this is a picture of a forest preserve where common buckthorn, that's our biggest nemesis, in terms of threatening the biodiversity, has completely taken over. You can see that underneath this, there's basically nothing else living. There's no other living plants. And without those plants, obviously we lose the insect fauna and everything else that relies on those insects, and the whole system starts to crash. Once we've done management and we've removed the invasive species, return fire to the system, and also sometimes selectively removing native trees to allow enough sunlight in, we have a huge, huge response. sometimes hopefully from the seed bank, but sometimes we supplement it with seed that volunteers and staff and others collect. It really just depends on how degraded that area was and how much additional help we need to give to that piece of land. And we did a big study with the Illinois Natural History Survey to understand in Cook County what were the biggest threats to our threatened and endangered species. And this kind of just breaks it out. You might be surprised that we have over 100 threatened and endangered species in the forest preserve of Cook County, even though we're the second most populous county in the United States. But because this land was set aside over 110 years or so now, we kind of we still have some amazing biodiversity. And you can see that the biggest threats that we have are woody encroachment, again, where we're not maintaining the structure to allow sunlight to reach the ground layer, or the introduction of invasive plants. And then of course, there's a bunch of other things that we also are challenged with that I'm gonna not cover right now. So again, when we're trying to do these restoration this restoration work, we're trying to maintain and restore biodiversity as much as we can. And that's not just plant biodiversity. We're trying to think about the birds, the insects, and all the other megafauna that people know and love. We also want to ensure that, again, we're making enough light reach the ground layer. And the other thing that's really important is we need to stabilize that soil, because if we just have bare soil, especially if it's on a slope or something, and we're not stabilizing it with the graminoids and the other things, then we start to lose the topsoil, which is another huge struggle and making it even harder to stabilize the system. And then we've got issues with severe soil erosion, and that impacting our wetlands and also river and stream conditions. And then of course, we're trying to eliminate some of these invasive plants and keep them at a manageable level. So we don't have any kind of, maybe in the future, but not any time that I think it's gonna happen in my lifetime at least, we don't have the ability to completely eliminate these invasive plants, but we wanna get them to a level where we can maintain that biodiversity, and with fire and minimal other engagement, keep that habitat relatively stable and healthy. So the kind of ecological restoration activities that we do are invasive shrub removal, which I just talked about. This is one of my colleagues holding a big pile in the winter of an invasive shrub. I'm not going to identify that, but if anyone wants to try, they can let me know. Maybe we could have a lottery game at the end of the presentation to what she's holding. But basically, especially in the winter, we'll go in and we'll clear some of these invasive species. We'll selectively thin trees depending on what we see about the history of the site, also the current plants that are present on the ground layer. We'll do some follow-up control of those invasives, and then we'll try to start implementing burns. And when we have to, or when we can, we'll try to do native seed collecting and dispersal. Sometimes we would love to do that with a lot more of our projects, but it's very expensive. So, sometimes we're not completely relying on that native seed. And depending on the site, we might see a lot of recovery. So now that I've kind of shared the real basics of why we do what we do, I'm going to go over the monitoring results of some of the sites that I've collected data on in partnership with my colleague, Dan Spencer, who I put on the front of the presentation because I just want to acknowledge that he helped me a great deal. We worked in a partnership, and actually Gene Seller helped me as well with collecting some of this data. And then he helped me analyze the data and do some of the work with it. So shout out to him. So with the restoration monitoring, before people do the restoration work, the invasive species removal, the tree thinning, we wanted to collect vegetation sampling to understand what the vegetation was before we did the work, and then we collected data after the program. So, I'm in various stages with this data, but a couple of the sites were all the invasives, and the work was done beginning in 2011, where we collected the pre-survey data, and then we collected it again in 2013. 2018. So it just kind of depends on how old that restoration site. So I'm going to be sharing you data from different sites. When we do the vegetation monitoring, you can kind of see in the picture, we would lay down a transect line, and then we would collect data in these 1/4 meter squared quadrats. where we identify everything to species and we measure the coverage and abundance of the plants found in those quadrats. And then we analyze the data using the floristic quality assessment method. And we compare those two data sets to try to understand the benefits or the negatives of that restoration. As much as possible, we also try to do photo monitoring. So for most of these sites, I have good photo monitoring pictures. So obviously before the work gets done, we're going to take a pre-picture and then we're going to go to that exact same location and do a post picture. And we want to be able to use this photography to document changes over time. And we use a GPS and metal stakes and other things to make sure that we can get back to that exact same location to collect the monitoring data as well as the picture data. I'm going to be covering 3 sites during the presentation today. So the first site, or one of the sites we're going to talk about, is Michigan City Road, Savannah. That's a Savannah woodland site. I would argue at this point it's more of a woodland because we haven't done as much tree removal as I think is warranted, but it's officially called a Savannah. And then I'm going to be sharing some data from Bobian Woods in a prairie system where we did restoration, as well as Dalton Prairie where we did some restoration. Okay, so here are some data from Bobian Woods and Prairie. So I'm just going to explain what these different things are. Some of them, I don't know everyone's scientific background, so I'm just going to explain all these. Native species richness, this just basically means the number of species that we found in these quadrats. So, you know, we're not counting the invasives, it's only native species that we're counting. Native mean C is every plant in the forest preserves of Cook County in the Chicago region is assigned a number, and that number is called a coefficient of conservatism. And the coefficient of conservatism, and I'm going to make a bad joke here, but it helps people remember, is it's not because the plants are Republicans, right? They are, what this means is that some plants are more adapted to modern disturbance of their habitat than others. So an example might be that tall goldenrod is a plant that is very tolerant of soil disturbance. You're going to find it in an old field along the side of a roadway, versus something like a Baltonia asteroides is definitely not very tolerant of human disturbance of the environment, and it's going to be giving it a much higher number. So the goldenrod would be a 1, and something, I don't remember the exact coefficient of conservatism for this plant, but it's probably an 8 or a 9. So something that is definitely much more conservative. And so when you have a native mean C, the higher the number, the better that site, the condition of the site is. So that's just one way to measure what we're looking at. We also measured the woody plant cover. So how much of that quadrat is covered by woody plants. And that's a really good indicator, because when we're looking at invasive species in terms of plants, we're mostly looking at invasive woody shrubs that are shading out the ground layer. So that's a really helpful indicator for us. And then we also measured what is the cover of the graminoids and the other ground layer species that we care about. So what is the coverage? How much of that quadrat is shaded when you look above it with vegetation of grasses, sedges, and forbs? And then last is the invasive species cover. So that is the cover of those invasive species. And as you can see, we've had some really positive results looking at Bobian Woods from 2011 to 2018. So you can see that our native species richness mostly went up, but it did go down a little bit in 2018, but mostly going up. The native mean C definitely went up with more conservative plants coming in, and the woody invasive plant cover went down as well. We also had a decrease in woody plant cover with more sun reaching the ground layer. And the most positive aspect is we have a lot more sedges, grasses, and forbs holding down that soil and competing with those invasive plants, which also allows us to return fire to the system. And here's just a picture so you can kind of see what it looks like. On the left is a picture of what Bobian looked like before we did the restoration work. And on the right is a picture of what it looked like during that initial transect data that we collected back in 2013. And then I'm going to show you a picture of what the site looks like today. I just took this picture for the presentation a couple weeks ago. you can see that there's now a really healthy layer of sedges, grasses, and forbs, and definitely enough sunlight reaching the ground layer for us to be able to manage this site and the biodiversity with fire. Okay, so next I want to show you Dalton Prairie. Dalton Prairie is a site that I am very excited about. This was a site that the Forest Preserve purchased from a waste management company back in 2010, and it had been on the original Illinois Natural Areas Inventory Index in the 1970s. Unfortunately, we didn't get to buy it until 2010. So the site had degraded significantly because obviously waste management was not exactly worried about maintaining the plant biodiversity at the site or anything for that matter. We're just lucky it didn't get completely destroyed before we were able to acquire it. And so when we look at the native species richness, you can see that it went up like threefold from the time that we originally monitored until 2018, which is really, really heartening and wonderful. And we also saw the native mean C start to increase. Woody plant cover definitely decreased drastically, and ground cover of native forbs and sedges went up. I don't know, I'm not very good at actually math, so whatever you want to do there, I think it's almost 4 times better. So really, really exciting. And it definitely, our invasive species coverage went down considerably. And we're seeing new exciting species like Moodwidgia polycarpa. You know, that's a new species that we didn't know was on the site until I identified it back in 2018. And this is a drastic change. So you can kind of see on the left is what Dalton Prairie looked like. You had some native vegetation barely hanging on under an onslaught of invasive shrubs, as well as native shrubs because of a lack of fire in the landscape. And then once we had originally done all the hard restoration work in 2013, this is the exact same location. And this is a recent picture of what the site looks like today. So we're seeing a really amazing recovery of the site, again, with really large increases in the biodiversity of that site. And I'm going to talk about why I think this site recovered so well in a couple minutes, but basically this is wet prairie and marsh, and I think that's why it recovered so well. Okay, so my data from Michigan City Road Savannah is a little bit newer. So this site was, the work was done much more recently, and with the pandemic, I haven't been able to re-sample it, but we did the work in 2017, pre the work, and then we did it again in 2018. And we can see this was a little bit, we definitely saw an increase in native species richness, but the native mean C did go down a little bit. I think that's because we didn't find any of this huckleberry, which is a very conservative native shrub in the transects this time. And so they believe that was the drop in the mean C, although this particular plant is still found quite prevalently at the site. We saw the woody plant cover decrease substantially, and we also saw a really good response on the ground layer cover of the graminoids and forbs, and a decrease in invasive species cover. So again, pretty good, but I want to collect some data in the future so we can continue to document this and see more, see if we see more change over time. And unfortunately, I don't have the pre-picture. I wasn't able to find it, but you can kind of see this is what the site looks like today. We don't see a lot of invasive brush in here. More sunlight is reaching the ground layer. I would argue that the trees are a little bit too dense still, and that's why we're still seeing some bare patches. And if we can get some selective tree thinning, that will allow the site to even recover a little bit more. But it's a work in progress, and we're still working really hard to control the invasive species and things and be able to return this site to a regular fire regime. So just to summarize some of the major findings from our work and this data. So we know that native forb, grass, and sedge species that typically dominate healthy natural areas have increased substantially at all 3 of the project sites that I've discussed. We also did have some locations where invasive shrubs slightly increased, Some of that was because of poor prescribed burns. So Michigan City Road Savannah, one of the challenges of that site is it's a smaller unit surrounded by roads. So it has been a little bit harder to have enough fires in the system to control some of the woody invasives. And we still have the buckthorn seeds in the seed bank. So it's going to take us a little while to make sure that we're not, we're continually fighting that new crop of common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn that's coming in. Dalton Prairie had the strongest recovery, in part because it is what I believe the answer is it's a wet sand prairie system. And we know that in restorations where often if we do them in areas where there's not a lot of hydrology, severe issues, and dirty water not entering the system, that the seed bank and things tends to be a little bit more intact in our wet prairies. And so there's a better response in the seed bank. So I think that's some of the reasons we've seen such a really amazing response at the site. Recovery takes time, when we're basically restoring an area and bringing it back to a semblance of ecological health. And so I'm expecting, and I would be happy to share the results later, of the response that some of these sites take as we continue to monitor. So, I think Michigan City Road, I would be really interested in monitoring this again in the very near future so that we can kind of see what has changed from 2018 till now. So special thanks to the Minnesota Wildflower website for allowing me to use their photos in my presentations. Obviously, a big shout out to Gene Seller for helping to collect some of this data. And also, I cannot not give a shout out to the Friends of the Forest Preserves Calumet Conservation Corps crew. They're one of the big groups that have worked extremely hard to maintain and restore this land by controlling invasive species and assisting us with prescribed burns. But I also want to acknowledge that we also have a lot of volunteers and staff that have also worked very hard to restore these sites. So at this point, I would be happy to take any questions.